All right, today we are diving deep into the psychology of financial bubbles, and we're going to tackle that terrifying question. Why is it that when you're caught inside one, it's almost impossible to even know it? Let's kick things off with a really powerful idea. See, the most dangerous moment in any bubble, it's not the big crash you see on the news. No, it's that quiet period right before it all goes wrong. It's the moment when all the doubt, all the skepticism just disappears.
So that really brings us to the central mystery, doesn't it? We look back at these bubbles and they seem completely insane. Hindsight's 2020, right? But why do they always feel so perfectly rational when you're in them? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. Let's break down the psychological forces that are really at play here.
First up, we've got to talk about something called the progress paradox. And this is really the core idea here. Bubbles never show up wearing a sign that says, "Warning, wild excess ahead." Nope. They disguise themselves. They look and feel like inevitable progress.
And this really gets at that crucial disconnect. Our expectation of a bubble is all hysteria, mania, and just pure greed. But the reality, for the people inside, it feels like logic. It feels like inevitability. They don't think they're gambling or speculating. They honestly believe they're just adapting to what the future is going to look like. And here's the thing, bubbles aren't built on thin air. They're almost always built on a tiny kernel of truth, a real game-changing innovation. I mean, look at this. From tulips in the 17th century, which represented a whole new kind of market structure, to railroads being part of a national destiny, all the way to the internet literally ending distance. The innovation itself is real. It's the story we tell ourselves about it, the expectations that get stretched way, way past the breaking point. Okay, so if that real innovation is just the seed, what's the fertilizer that makes it grow into this full-blown, out-of-control bubble? Well, it all comes down to the story, the narrative we tell about it. Because inside a bubble, believe me, the story is king. And this brings us to a really important concept called narrative economics. The basic idea is that we humans, we don't actually make sense of big, uncertain financial questions with spreadsheets and data. No, we do it with stories. A really good story, a compelling narrative, it cuts through the noise, it reduces all that uncertainty, and it makes the future feel, well, kind of predictable. And this is the absolute key takeaway. Once that story is powerful enough, the numbers, they barely matter. They become secondary. It's not that we believe because the math adds up. It's that we force the math to add up because we already believe. The belief always, always leads the numbers. All right, so how does one person's belief, or even a small group's belief, suddenly morph into this massive ironclad consensus that nobody questions? Let's take a look under the hood at the psychological machinery that does this. We can call it the consensus engine. So this engine is really powered by 4 key psychological forces. First, you've got social proof. Super simple. If everyone else is buying, it feels safer to buy too, right? Rising prices become their own best advertisement. Then there's confirmation bias. This is where we actively hunt for any piece of data that supports the story, and we just ignore or explain away anything that doesn't fit. Third is a big one, overconfidence. A little bit of early success makes us feel like a genius, not just lucky. And everyone thinks they're smart enough to get out right before the top. And finally, you get authority bias. Once the big banks, the major institutions jump on board, well, any lingering doubt just collapses. The whole story feels officially endorsed.
And this quote just nails it. All that pressure builds up, and at a certain point, being the skeptic in the room, it gets expensive. Not just socially, but professionally. Your career risk starts to feel bigger than the financial risk. And that's when it becomes so much easier to be wrong with the crowd than to be right all by yourself.
So you take all these forces, you mix them together, and what you get is this perfectly self-sealing reality, a feedback loop. From the inside, it doesn't feel like madness or a crazy speculative frenzy. It just feels like reality, the new normal. Those core assumptions aren't even on the table for debate anymore. They become the very air that everybody is breathing. Okay, so let's make this real. Let's take this whole framework we've just built and apply it to something that's on everyone's mind right now, the AI question. What we're seeing here is a classic symptom, a potential red flag, concentration. You have a tiny handful of AI-related companies driving a huge percentage of the market's gains. And that right there shows you how both the money and the belief are just funneling into one single, incredibly powerful story. Now, traditionally, the first question an investor is supposed to ask is pretty simple. What is this thing actually worth? A question based on the fundamentals, on cash flows, on solid valuation. But when you're inside one of these powerful narratives, the question flips. It changes. It becomes, how exposed am I if this thing keeps running without me? See the shift? The fear of missing out, FOMO, and that career risk we talked about, they've completely pushed fundamental analysis to the side. And that, right there, is a defining feature of a late-stage bubble. So, if all these psychological forces are so powerful and they keep reinforcing each other, what on earth could possibly make them stop? Well, let's look at what happens when that belief finally breaks. You know, there's this huge misconception that bubbles pop because everybody wakes up one morning and has this collective aha moment where they realize they were all wrong. It doesn't work like that. What really happens is that one single critical piece of the story breaks. A crack appears in that core assumption, and that one little crack is all it takes for the entire structure to become dangerously unstable. Because at the end of the day, what's holding this whole thing up, it isn't the fundamentals. It's not the spreadsheets. It's something much more fragile. It's just confidence. And here's the scary part. That confidence, it doesn't gently fade away. It doesn't unwind slowly over a few weeks. It snaps. And just like that, the whole engine gets thrown into reverse. The very same forces that built the bubble up now work to tear it down, and with terrifying speed. Social proof, that turns into panic selling. Confirmation bias, now it's actively hunting for bad news to confirm the new negative story. The authorities, they retreat into silence. And all that overconfidence? Poof, it evaporates instantly. So what's the big takeaway here? How in the world can you protect yourself from these incredibly powerful forces? Well, the answer isn't what you might think. It lies in our final idea, understanding your core assumption. And this might be the most important point of all. You are not going to predict the top. You are not going to time the crash. I mean, history shows us again and again that it's just about impossible. So the real defense isn't having some crystal ball to see the future. It's having a mirror to understand yourself. The real goal here is self-awareness. So I want to leave you with this final question. Forget about trying to spot the big bubble out there in the market. That's a fool's errand. Instead, look inward. Look at your own portfolio, your own investments, your own big ideas, and ask yourself this simple question. What is the one single story, the one core assumption that everything else is resting on? Because truly understanding that, well, that might just be the one thing that saves you when the story inevitably changes.